You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art Ed?
We'll try to spice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art Ed me?
Yeah. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, weekly art history for all ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today, my guest coming to me all the way from Sydney, Australia, and from what I understand of the time change, coming from the future, I've got Chris Boylan. Thank you very much for joining me.
Kyle, very happy to be here. Thank you.
I'm really excited because, well, for one, I always get super excited to talk to people in other parts of the world and get different perspectives that from people I wouldn't have met otherwise. But also, longtime listeners know I am largely a modernist, but I want to understand and appreciate all different types of art. And you are quite the expert on Oceanic art. You've got let's see if I can get this pronunciation right. You were coaching me before we hit record. The Laiagam Stone. I didn't get that, did I?
That's very close. That's good. Laiagam.
Laiagam. The Laiagam Stone. But it is, from what I understand, it's an ancient, like 3,500-year-old stone carved in Papua New Guinea, right?
Correct.
Yeah. Except for all my butchering of all pronunciation, which longtime listeners probably expected, but I'm just going to apologize in advance because there's going to be a whole lot more words that I have read but not heard in my life.
Kyle, one little fact about stone, it's impossible to age stone because, of course, we know it's millions of years old. But this stone has been aged to 3,500 years or thereabouts, only because a very similar stone is in the National Gallery of Australia. And unfortunately, when it was on loan, it got broken. And they found a tiny root growing inside the break. And this root was carbon dated to 3,500 years. And my stone is very, very similar to the one that was broken in from the National Gallery of Australia.
Are you talking about the Ambum Stone?
Yes, the
something?
Ambum Stone, right.
Yeah.
Which probably, certainly the most famous carved stone from Papua New Guinea. And for me, it's one of the great objects of oceanic art in the world.
Yeah, that's certainly one of the famous ones and became significantly more famous. I think it was around 2000 that it was on display in France and like someone dropped it. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct. But there's always a silver lining, you see, and that's when they found this little root that had grown down to a tiny crack in the stone, and they could actually carbon date the root.
Yeah.
And that's when the National Gallery came up with the approximate age of 3,500 years.
Yeah, that is so interesting.
Yes.
Now, as I said, obviously you know quite a bit about oceanic art. Can you just tell me, before we get into the Laiagam Stone, can you just tell me, how did you get into this type of art? If I recall correctly, your background was architecture before you got into this. Am I right?
That's correct. I grew up in Australia and educated here. I studied architecture at Sydney University, but we have a year off in the middle of the course, and I traveled to Papua New Guinea, knowing people there, because my father had a lot of contacts with Papua New Guinea. He was involved in development work around the Pacific, but particularly in Papua New Guinea. So I traveled up to Papua New Guinea even in my high school years. And in that year off, I was offered a job working in Papua New Guinea, specifically on cultural projects. And I spent the year there. Then I postponed my university and spent another year there. And it was the most incredible time of my life, in a way, working on cultural projects in Papua New Guinea. But I came back, finished the course, worked for a couple of years as an architect, and then, unfortunately, I got bored with it. I thought, this is not what I want to do. I just love this art, this culture so much that I jumped ship, left architecture behind, and became involved in Oceanic Art. And that was more than 30 years ago.
Now, are you focusing specifically on just Papua New Guinea, or are you looking at the art from different indigenous peoples in the area? I know it seems like particularly indigenous people's artwork from more ancient times, or are you looking at different time periods as well?
The term oceanic applies to basically the whole of the Pacific. You can imagine a triangle that includes Papua New Guinea, Australia, and it would go across as far as Hawaii and Easter Island. So it includes all those islands in between, Fiji, Vanuatu, Tahiti, New Zealand, and that's the area that I concentrate on.
Okay, so you do look at all the oceanic cultures.
I do. But having said that, Papua New Guinea is like the second biggest island in the world, and in terms of oceanic population, it would probably comprise 90% of Oceania. It's a huge country, big population, and within Papua New Guinea, there are 800 distinct languages and therefore distinct cultural groups, and it's the most incredible country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, like I say, there's a lot to it, and that's why I was curious if you specialized, or if you were more spread out across all of those different cultures. And are you looking at work from different time periods, or do you specialize in one?
Well, over time, from working for a gallery here in Sydney, the city, then I set up my own gallery with a partner. And eventually, I left the gallery and went out on my own without a gallery. So what I do now is exhibitions. And as time has progressed, the exhibitions have become more and more focused on the older objects, the more important ritual objects from Oceania. And with Papua New Guinea being such an important and large part of Oceania, I tend to focus on New Guinea pieces.
Yeah. Now, with, I guess, what drew you to those ritual objects and those older artifacts? Everyone looks at art in different ways. Some people look at it as a window into culture. Some people look at it and they have this gut visceral response that, resonates with them emotionally or aesthetically. What is it that drew you to this type of work?
There is a power in the older pieces. You look at these old pieces that have been used in ritual and they look back at you. It's an incredible feeling. And sometimes you even get the feeling that, is there a spirit in this piece? And it's nothing you can really prove one way or another, but occasionally you get this feeling that is the case. But I do also deal in many other things apart from the old ritual pieces. And if I give you one example, the highlands of Papua New Guinea has always been one of my favorite areas. That's where the Laiagam Stone came from. And I think later in the talk, we'll focus on that one. Yeah. But when the highlands was first opened up to the outside world in 1933, it was a Stone Age culture that had no contact with the outside world for 30 or 40,000 years. So incredible place to travel into, even in the 70s, when I started going there, 1970s, 1980s, there was still a lot of the older traditional life survived. And I fell in love with shields. So I've been collecting a lot of shields in the highlands and elsewhere. But by 1980, or soon after, the first generation of educated Highlanders started to paint new designs on their shields. And one of the designs I really loved was the Phantom, which they took from the comics that they were reading as kids. And I started to collect Phantom shields, which by their nature had to be contemporary. They were 1990s, 2000. So I'm equally excited by contemporary production out of Papua New Guinea and elsewhere as the olden ritual. And over the years, I've had a number of exhibitions of phantom shields and always been successful because it has that connection between contemporary and traditional.
Now, as you're talking about these with exhibitions of, contemporary stuff from Papua New Guinea and the traditional stuff, I'm starting to think, like, are there complicating factors with bringing these objects to different locations, different museums? I know with the Ambum Stone, there was a lot of questioning of, like, what was that even doing in France? I think it was France where it was dropped. Should it be held in Papua New Guinea and stuff like, do you have complicating factors with all of that?
I've never had any complications myself because there's very clear regulations about the export of artworks from Papua New Guinea, with the National Museum, based in Port Moresby, the capital, inspects pieces before they leave the country. And I've had very good relationship with the museum, the directors, the staff there. So before anything that I've collected looks, they will inspect the pieces and give an export permit. And from time to time, they've said, we don't want that piece to leave, or we like that piece. And theoretically, they should then buy it from me. But of course, as institutions like this don't have any money, it's always been a donation back to the museum. And that's happened from time to time.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was getting at. Like, so you do work with the government, and they do look at what's taken, and it's cleared to leave before you can move a piece to another gallery or okay. Yeah, because I was just thinking, like, I guess ethical implications and stuff like that, because we know historically there have been some problems in different cultures and stuff like that.
This is true, and I think unfortunately that's the situation. I mean, Australia was the colonial power in Papua New Guinea for quite a long time. I mean, colonial is not quite the right term. It was never a colony. It was always a trust territory under the United League of Nations first, and the United Nations, because the north part of New Guinea was a German territory, and the southern part was a British territory. Then after the First World War, the League of Nations asked Australia to be to take it under trust and administer Papua New Guinea as one area, if you like. They got independence in 1975, so a lot of pieces probably left Papua New Guinea before that, when it was, if you like, a colony rather than an independent country.
Yeah. Now, I think there were maybe just a few dozen pieces similar to the Laiagam Stone, but really probably the only real comparison is the Ambum Stone in terms of the size and, like, all the pieces intact. Am I correct in that? The Laiagam.
Absolutely. There could be 20 or 30 stone figures out there from the same region of Papua New Guinea called Enga. It's up in the mountains in the western area of the highlands. And Laiagam, where this particular stone we're going to talk about later comes from, is one valley, and Ambum is another valley. And the Ambum Stone was recorded as coming from the Ambum Valley, and that's why it's acquired this name. And it first appeared publicly in London in 1976 or 1977, thereabouts. And the dealer in London, Philip Goldman, sold it to the National Gallery in Australia.
Yeah, that was, I think the 70s was right around the time that the National Gallery was established, right? Like, I think there was the whole thing of the Pollock and the blue poles, right? And the Ambum Stone was shortly after that, if I recall correct.
You're absolutely right again. Yes. And I mean, the blue poles, for example, painting was very contentious because it was a lot of money to spend at the time. But my God, what it's worth today.
They
is
could have
up.
gotten a Rembrandt,
Yeah. And the Ambum Stone at the time too. Many people said you're crazy to pay that much for it, and I think something like, what was it? 120,000 US dollars was paid for the Ambum Stone in 1977, and it's valued at a lot more than that now. I can tell you, the value of the Ambum Stone today is $6 million.
Yeah, it seems like the Australian government was making some really good art investments back when they opened the gallery, because I think the Pollock came out as a significant multiple of what they paid for it as well.
Yes. The first director, a great director, and he's government the gallery in a very good direction. Hasn't always been the case since, unfortunately.
I feel like that's the way these things always go. We start off well and then lose a little bit of steam, and then it'll come back. These things are always cyclical.
Oh, it will. It will get the right person, and the whole enthusiasm and vision can come back again.
Now, after a short break, we're going to come back again and get a little bit deeper into the weeds on the Laiagam Stone, and hopefully, for once, I'll pronounce it correctly. Now we're back, and I have here with me Chris Boylan. Well, not quite here with me, all the way down in Australia, to explain about the Laiagam Stone. And this is a really old and rare piece from Papua New Guinea. It's most closely compared to the Ambum Stone, which my AP art history students will be hopefully familiar with. And if you're not familiar with it, maybe study for the test a little bit harder. But Chris, can you just tell us a little bit about the Laiagam Stone? You've already talked about where it came from, and I guess we also got a hint at the date of it, but can you just describe the piece? I mean, what does it look like? What's the symbolism we see in here? Theories about the purpose, because I know it's not like the person who carved it would have left an artist's statement behind, but what do we think we know about this piece?
Carl, there's a certain amount of conjecture because the piece is so old. There's no way to talk to the people who created it. And also many of these stone figures, and there are also bowls, mortars and pestles in the highlands areas, are dug up when people are making gardens or making houses. And so a lot of the information about when they were made, how they were made, why they were made is conjecture. Mm-hmm. Now, when it comes to this particular stone, the Laiagam Stone and the Ambum Stone, there are several people have studied them in detail, and the probably the two most important experts, if you like, in the world, both happen to live in Canberra, the capital of Australia, and both of them have seen the Laiagam Stone, and both of them are absolutely familiar with the Ambum Stone. Now, it's small. It would be approximately 8 inches high, about 20 centimeters. And the two stones, the Laiagam Stone, which is the one I possess, and the Ambum Stone, are almost identical in size, shape. The forms, the image, if you like, is slightly different, and but essentially the same. It has an extended neck, the two protruding eyes, the neck comes into the face, which bends over, and it has like a proboscis down below. There are two arms extended around the body. The legs appear, and then at the bottom of the Laiagam Stone is a small protrusion that almost seems to suggest it might fit into something or be buried to make it stand up, where the Ambum Stone is quite flat on the bottom. It doesn't have that protrusion. So there are some differences. And if you can see below the extended belly that some people suggest is pregnancy, is what could be a pouch with a small baby in it, or it could be a penis. So again, it's hard to be sure what it is. Now, what many experts have suggested is that it's representing a fetus of the echidna. It's a spiny anteater, and two varieties of these live in the highlands. And one, the long-nosed echidna, actually has a long nose, and it does look to some extent like the fetus of the echidna, the long-nosed echidna. One of the two experts actually studied the Laiagam Stone and has written a paper on it. And he's suggesting that the difference between the two, the Laiagam and the Ambum stones, is the Laiagam Stone has slightly more anthropomorphic style to it. So the Ambum Stone, if you like, is more zoomorphic, and this one is just slightly more anthropomorphic. But overall, the images are very, very similar. The size is similar. And from one of the experts, his suggestion is that the age is also very similar, that the Laiagam Stone was probably carved at a similar time span to the Ambum Stone.
Do we know anything about, obviously it's not like signed by the artist, but do we know anything about how it was produced? What types of tools would have been used?
It's been chipped. And if you look closely at the surface, there are tiny little, almost like pockmarks. So it has almost certainly been made with a harder stone and chipped very, very gently and carefully to produce the form, and then develop more and more detail. But it would be, of course, they had no metal tools. They didn't have any electric grinders. It would have been carefully and very slowly chipped away. And whoever made this was a master carver.
Yeah, I can't imagine making something like that with modern tools, let alone with just another stone. Hats off to whoever was able to make that work.
There's we think back to someone like, Michelangelo doing David. How does he conceive of that block of stone and what's going to come out of it? And I would feel the same way about this artist. How did he conceive from the beginning? He's got a block of stone in front of him, and slowly, he this Laiagam Stone emerges from it. And part of it may be following the grain in the stone, if there is such a thing, or I don't know, his imagination and his talent, his experience, just slowly bring it to life.
Yeah, it's amazing to me when I stop to think about like all the other stuff that needed to be done to hunt and to grow food and to build shelters and survive, and someone also found time to grab a stone and chisel away at another stone to make these pieces. Obviously, it was very meaningful and important for them to invest that time and labor in doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep in mind too that whoever made the Laiagam Stone was a very experienced carver, and almost certainly an older man. So I would tend to think that the younger men would take on the arduous tasks of hunting, of warfare, of garden making. The older men are there for their knowledge, their experience, contributions to ceremonial life, ritual life, communication with the spirits, and making things like the Laiagam Stone. People have been in the Guinea Highlands for certainly 30, 40,000 years and built up a very sophisticated culture. And part of that culture is the carving of stone bowls and pestles, the carving of stone figures, And for some reason, the figures seem to be most prolific in the Engen region, and no one's quite sure why.
Now, if we could, shifting a slight bit, you said there's a big tradition of these carved stone objects. What would be the reason behind them, or the theorized reason? Are these functional objects? Are they ceremonial? Are they ritual? Are they, part of a religious practice? Is this, like a decorative piece? What's the supposed function here?
It's pretty well ascertained that they have to do with ceremony and ritual. And generally throughout the Highlands, people have a belief that the fertility of the world, meaning the ground, the bush, the people, is something that needs to be continually upgraded, if you like. That fertility slowly erodes.
Mhm.
And this stone, these stones are part of that fertility ritual that must be held every number of years to retain the fertility of the world.
Okay, so it's a fertility piece, for ritual purposes.
Yes. I mean, there could be other levels of meaning that we're not aware of. Part of the rituals when these ceremonies happen is the killing of pigs, and the blood of the pigs is often either put in the stone bowls or rubbed over the stone figures. And the figures would carefully be wrapped up after ceremony and either buried, which apparently often happened, or they would be kept in a special magic house that only the big men had access to.
And I just got to say thank you so much, because I was grasping for the way to ask, like, what was this ritual, or what would it look like? And I was trying to think of how to phrase that question, and you just already read my mind. So thank you for that. Now that we have kind of an idea for what this stone is and maybe how it would have been used, can you tell us, like, what we know of the history of it beyond just like, well, stones are old, and this one is probably about as old as the Ambum Stone. What is the history of this particular piece?
It came out of Papua New Guinea in the early 1960s. In 1962, 1963, an Australian geologist, Ron Ingle, worked for Dorset Engineering, and he worked in that area of Enga province around Laiagam Valley and various places, and working on roads and various engineering projects. And he became absolutely obsessed with stones, and he collected them. Stone bowls, stone mortars and pestles, a few stone figures, and some like would represent birds, represent possums, any number of stone figures. One of the experts suggests that, as well as fertility, these stones were related to hunting, because often when they're found in the ground, they're not actually in the villages, the old villages, but they're further out on the tracks that lead up into the mountains or into other uninhabited valleys that suggest they to do with hunting, finding food. And anyway, getting back to Ron Ingle, he worked in Papua New Guinea for 2 or 3 years, and he came back to Australia with his collection of stone objects, and he lived with them for a long, long time. It was only more recently, that he decided to part with some of them, and I started to acquire some of his stone objects. And now these earlier ones that I acquired from him, they've gone into various collections. But this particular piece was always his favourite, and he never wanted to part with it.
So then why did he ultimately part with it? Or how did it come to you?
Well, he didn't part with it himself. He kept it, but like all of us, one day he passed away, and then it wasn't that long his wife passed away. But it had always been in the knowledge of the daughters that if they didn't want to keep it, wanted to sell it, to contact me, because I'd been one of the few people who had ever purchased pieces from Ron, and he felt comfortable selling them to me. And so I was lucky enough to acquire the stone, and that would have been what, quite a few years ago, 8, 9 years ago.
And so you've been holding on to it in your personal collection for close to a decade.
Yes. Well, I'm taking it. I do an exhibition in Paris every year in September, and I finally thought I'd take it to Paris and put it on display with all my other oceanic art pieces. I usually take 50 or 60 pieces to Paris, and I have a small gallery during the Paris exhibition called Parcours du Monde. It's on every September. This year it's been pushed back a little bit because of something called the Olympics. And
I've heard of it.
and I'm going to put it on display now. Whether I sell it, I'm not sure. It's going on display.
Yeah.
And I'll have a story of it, and basically presenting it for the first time publicly.
Okay, so this is the first public display of it, but it's getting close to the end of the episode, and the way that I typically wrap it is talking about where pieces belong. And my normal rating scale would be to ask people, is this one for the Louvre? Is this one for the lab? Or is this one for the Louvre?
Uh-huh.
Is this a museum piece to cherish for the ages? Something we can learn from in the lab, sort of the eat your vegetables version of art? Or is this something for the Louvre? Maybe it has its time and place, but we don't need to dwell on that. But I was thinking with this piece, if it were to exit your collection, where do you think would be the appropriate place to display it? That's the question that I want to ask you, because one of the things that I've noticed here, I live in the suburbs of Chicago, and we have wonderful museums. We have the Art Institute of Chicago, and then we have the Field Museum, which is more about, natural history and culture. And there's a lot of overlap in those collections and the types of things that they have, although they're displayed very differently. And that's actually kind of how I came to ask that question of people as I wrap up a lot of stuff, is just thinking about, like, where do you see the purpose of this piece? How should it be displayed? How should people take it in? What lens should we view it through? And so I'm curious, if it were to leave your collection, what kind of institution would you want to see it in? How would you want it displayed?
However it was displayed, it could be done either way. I think the important thing is that the story goes with the piece, from where it was collected, the collector, and the history as known of these pieces, what they were used for. If wherever the piece goes, however it's displayed, it needs the history and the context to move with it. And so often with tribal pieces, oceanic pieces, or African pieces, there's little context that goes with them. I think this one has a very good context to travel with it.
Well, I do have to say thank you so much for sharing your deep knowledge and expertise with this, because, oceanic art is not an area of expertise for me. I feel like nothing's an area of expertise for me, but I always love learning from people who know more than I do. So thank you so much once again for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and thank you very much for drawing out of me things probably I haven't thought about too.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.